Hi everyone, my name is Rachel Bennett. I'm 31 years old, and for most of my life, I thought I just wasn't very lovable. I want to tell you what happened with my family, my father's will, and a phone call I got 9 days after his funeral that changed everything I thought I understood about my life. I'm not telling you this for sympathy. I think a lot of you already know exactly where this story is going, and I think you need to hear how it ends. Because for a long time, I didn't think it would end well for me at all. Let me back up. I grew up outside Dayton, Ohio, in a brick house with white shutters that my dad built with his own hands before I was born. There were 2 kids, me and my younger brother Tyler, 2 years behind me. From the time I can remember anything, Tyler was the son and I was just in the room. When Tyler got a B+, my mother framed the report card. When I got straight A's, she said, "Well, that's just expected of you." I used to think that was a compliment. It took me 25 years to realize it wasn't. My dad was quieter. He'd take me to the hardware store on Saturdays and let me pick one tool from my own toolbox. I had a pink hammer. I still have it. It's one of the only things from my childhood I kept. My mother had a favorite, and she never tried very hard to hide it. I remember being 9, asking from the back seat why Tyler got to go to baseball camp, and I didn't get the art camp I'd asked for. She looked at me in the rearview mirror and said, "Because Tyler needs more attention than you do. You're independent." That's a good thing. I didn't understand back then that you're independent was just a softer way of saying you don't matter as much. When I was 14, my mother told me something I've never been able to forget. I'd just gotten my period for the first time, scared, and I went to find her, 'cause that's what you do at 14. She was annoyed I'd interrupted her phone call. When I finally told her what was happening, she sighed, and said, "Honestly, Rachel, you were never really planned." I don't know why I'm surprised you're difficult. I was 14 years old. I never told my dad what she said. Some part of me, even then, knew it would break something in him to hear it. If your family had an obvious favorite growing up, I'd love to know in the comments which sibling you were. I think the answer says a lot about who we became. By high school, the pattern was so established, nobody pretended otherwise. Tyler got a used Honda for his 16th birthday. My dad spent a whole weekend under the hood with him, teaching him to check the oil, change a tire, all of it. When I turned 16 2 years earlier, I got a bus pass and a lecture about how cars are expensive, and I needed to learn responsibility first. I remember asking, carefully, if maybe I could learn to change a tire too, just so I'd know how. My mother said there was no point since I wasn't getting a car anyway. Tyler failed junior year algebra, and my parents hired him a tutor within the week. I scored a 98 on my AP chemistry exam, the highest in my class, and nobody mentioned it at dinner. I actually brought the test home and set it on the kitchen counter, hoping someone would notice it sitting there. My mother moved it to make room for a casserole dish. I started keeping a journal around then, not because I was dramatic, but because I needed somewhere to put what nobody else seemed to notice. I still have those journals. Reading 16-year-old me describe her own household with that exhausted clarity broke my heart a little. She already knew, she just had nowhere to put it. My dad tried, in his quiet way, to balance things, milkshakes after bad days. Every track meet, even the 6 a.m. ones 40 minutes away, he never missed. But he never said anything when my mother favored Tyler. Not once, in front of me. I used to wonder if he even noticed. He noticed everything. I'll get to that, but we're not there yet. I got into Ohio State on a partial scholarship and worked 2 jobs to cover the rest, graduating with no debt. I thought maybe this would finally be the thing. At my graduation, my mother spent half the ceremony texting Tyler about some dispute with his girlfriend. If you've ever had a moment where you finally stop hoping a parent will become someone different, you know it doesn't feel like anger. It feels like quiet grief for a relationship you wanted, and were never going to get. I don't say any of this to make you hate my mother completely. People are complicated. She had her own messed up childhood, her own reasons for loving unevenly. None of that excuses what came later. But the damage was the same either way. By my mid-20s, I had a stable healthcare admin job, real savings, an apartment I'd furnished myself. Tyler had been through 3 jobs, 2 failed business ideas, and a car repossession, and every single time, my parents bailed him out. When he asked for $15,000 at 26 to start a landscaping business, they gave it without hesitation, even helping him draft a business plan over a weekend at the kitchen table. When I asked for a $4,000 loan at 24 to cover a gap while I switched jobs, offered in writing with interest, with a repayment schedule I'd already typed up myself, my mother told me, "We're not made of money, Rachel. You should be more careful with your finances." I remember sitting across from her at that same kitchen table, my printed repayment schedule between us, watching her barely glance at it before pushing it back toward me. I paid back every dollar I ever borrowed from anyone, ahead of schedule actually. Tyler never paid back a cent, and as far as I know, no one ever asked him to. Somehow, I was still the one who needed to be careful. Keep that detail in mind. It comes back in a courtroom. 2 years before my dad died at Thanksgiving, my mother announced, completely out of nowhere, that she and my dad were restructuring the estate plan to make sure Tyler would be taken care of after his second business failure. I put my fork down and asked what that meant for me. The table went quiet, the way it always did. Whenever I asked a direct question, nobody wanted to answer directly. She looked at me with total indifference and said, "Well, you've always been fine on your own, Rachel. You don't need the same kind of help Tyler does." I didn't argue. I want to be honest, some old, exhausted part of me had stopped expecting a different answer a long time before that dinner. I finished my plate in silence, said a quiet goodbye, and drove 2 hours home crying the whole way alone in the dark, the radio off, just me and the road, and that sentence playing over and over in my head. My dad called 3 days later. He almost never called just to talk, so when his name lit up my screen, my stomach dropped before I even answered. He didn't apologize for what my mother said. What he said instead was, "Rach, I need you to know that whatever happens, I love you the same as I love your brother. I need you to really hear that." I asked him directly why it felt like Mom was rewriting our whole family, and he was just letting her happen. A long pause, long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then, sometimes the fights you don't have are the ones that protect the people you love the most. I didn't get it then. I thought it was a vague dad-ism, one of those sentences that sounds wise, but doesn't actually mean anything specific. I didn't think about it again for almost 2 years. Then he died, and it became the most important thing anyone had ever said to me. My father passed from a sudden heart attack on a Tuesday morning, 64 years old. He'd gone out for the newspaper. My mother found him on the porch steps 20 minutes later. Tyler called me, not my mother. I noticed that even through the devastation. I drove 2 hours in a state I can barely remember. At the hospital, I sat next to my mother, put my hand on her arm, and for about 10 seconds, all the resentment disappeared, and we were just two people who'd lost the same man. Then she said quietly, "I don't know how Tyler is going to handle this. He was always closer to his father." 10 seconds. That's how long the truce lasted before my mother made even his death about Tyler. At the funeral, Tyler gave the eulogy. It was good. Fishing trips, learning to drive, the quiet, steady love our dad gave without needing credit. I cried through all of it, because it was true. What he didn't mention, not once, in an 8-minute eulogy was me, his sister, existing at all. I sat in the front pew and realized in real time I'd been quietly erased from the story. I didn't say anything. What was I going to do? Stand up at my father's funeral and demand to be mentioned? I just let it happen, the way I'd let almost everything happen for 31 years. The will reading came 11 days later, at the family lawyer's office. A man named Gregory Aldous. The 4 of us sat there, my mother, Tyler, his fiancée Madison, and me. The house my father built went entirely to Tyler. The savings, just under $400,000, went entirely to Tyler. A separate $50,000 trust for future business ventures went entirely to Tyler. Then Gregory turned a page and read my name. To my daughter, Rachel Elizabeth Bennett, I leave the ceramic coffee mug from my desk, the one she gave me for Father's Day when she was 7, because I want her to know I kept it every single day. That was it. The entire accounting of my place in this family. A coffee mug. Madison actually laughed. A short, surprised laugh, immediately covered. I will never forget that sound. My mother didn't laugh. She also didn't say a single word in my defense. She just looked at a spot on the wall. like this was simply the natural order of things. Tyler, and I'll give him this much credit, looked uncomfortable. He glanced at me, then looked away, like he couldn't hold eye contact with what had just happened. I didn't cry in that office. I felt a strange, hollow calm settle over me, the kind that comes right before something inside you finally breaks. I asked Gregory if that was everything. He hesitated, just 2 seconds, but I noticed, because lawyers don't usually hesitate reading a will they've reviewed a dozen times. That's everything outlined in this document, he said. This document. Not everything your father left. I was too busy holding myself together to catch the precision of those words. I left, drove home, and sat on my kitchen floor for 2 hours, staring at the cabinet where I'd eventually have to put that mug. If you'd been in that room, your name attached to a coffee mug while your sibling inherited a house, what would you have done? Said something on the spot? Or absorbed it quietly, the way you'd been trained to your whole life? I think a lot of you already know the answer for yourselves. 9 days later, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. A woman introduced herself as Diane Whitfield, an estate attorney with a small private practice. She needed to speak with me about my late father, Robert Bennett. I told her I'd already been through the will reading. She paused, then said something that made my chest go cold. Mrs. Bennett, I think you should come into my office in person. This isn't about that will. This is about a different one. I didn't sleep that night. I went to her office 2 days later, small tucked into a converted house on a quiet residential street. Nothing like Gregory's polished downtown practice with its leather chairs and skyline view. Diane had kind eyes and a careful, deliberate way of speaking, like someone who delivers difficult news for a living and has learned exactly how slowly to do it. She told me that 6 years before my father's death, he had come to her, not Gregory, privately, without my mother's knowledge, and had a separate, fully notarized will drawn up. I asked her why he would do that. Why go to a completely different lawyer, in secret, instead of just talking to the man who'd handled our family's affairs for 20 years? She slid a folder across the desk and said, I think the contents will answer that question better than I can. Yeah. I opened it with hands that genuinely would not stop shaking. I remember the paper felt heavier than it should have, the way important documents sometimes do, even though I know that's just in my head. My father left me the house. Not Tyler. Me. He left me 60% of his savings, with the remaining 40% split between Tyler and a trust for our mother's continued living expenses, should she outlive him. And in a separate clause, written in language so deliberate, it was clear he'd thought about it carefully. He stipulated that any future business funding for Tyler had to be jointly evaluated by myself and the estate's executor, meaning Tyler couldn't just be handed money without my say in it ever again. I read it 3 times before I could process it. A will from when I was 25 years old, 6 years before he died. Made before whatever happened in that marriage that eventually rewrote his intentions completely, board by board, the same way he'd once built that house. I asked Diane the obvious question, if this existed, why did Gregory read a completely different will? She explained that about 2 years after this one was made, my parents went together to Gregory and created a new will that legally superseded it, the one that left everything to Tyler. Under the law, the most recent valid will generally take precedence, unless there's a legitimate challenge, undue influence, lack of capacity, evidence the later will didn't reflect the testator's genuine wishes. Then she said the part that mattered most. Your father came back to my office 4 months before he died. He didn't change the will back, but he left something else, a letter. For you and only you, if I ever saw that the family will didn't reflect what he actually wanted. She handed me a sealed envelope in my father's handwriting. I didn't open it there. I asked to take it home. She also told me gently that given the existence of the earlier will, I had legal standing to contest the one already read, if I chose to. I drove home, sat at my kitchen table, not the floor this time, and opened it. I want to read you the parts that matter most. Rachel, if you're reading this, it means I never found the courage to fix what I let happen in our family while I was alive, and for that I am more sorry than you will probably ever understand. Your mother has never been cruel in her own mind. She loves your brother out of fear. fear that he'd never survive without constant rescuing. She poured everything into him because she was terrified of what would happen if she didn't. I've watched her do this for 30 years and failed to stop it for 30 years because every time I tried, it threatened to end our marriage, and I was a coward who valued my own comfort over your fairness. You never needed rescuing. You built yourself into someone capable and strong, and somewhere along the way, we mistook your strength for not needing us. Instead of understanding you needed us just as much, you simply never let it show the way Tyler did. I made a will 6 years ago that reflected what I actually believed was fair. I let your mother and Gregory talk me into changing it because I told myself it would keep peace, and because some part of me believed you'd be fine regardless, since you always have been. I was wrong, and I knew I was wrong even as I signed that second will. I have regretted it every day since. I'm not asking you to fix this for me. I'm asking you to fix it for yourself, because you've spent your whole life being told, in a dozen quiet ways, that you matter less. You don't. You never did. I just didn't say it loud enough, often enough, while I had the chance. I love you exactly as much as I love your brother. I should have proven that while I was alive, instead of leaving it for a lawyer to explain after I was gone. I'm sorry, Rachel. I'm so sorry. Dad. I cried at that table in a way I don't think I'd ever cried in my life. Not the contained crying from that drive home after Thanksgiving. This was 31 years of swallowed grief finally finding somewhere to go. Do you think my father's silence, choosing not to fight my mother while he was alive, makes him complicit in what happened to me? Or can people be flawed and cowardly in some ways while still genuinely loving you? I still don't think I've landed anywhere permanent on that question. I decided, sitting at that table, that I was going to contest the will. This wasn't really about the money. It was about 31 years of being told I was worth less, finally having legal proof that my father, at least in some version of himself, had seen me completely differently. I needed that proof to exist on the record. I needed it more than I needed the house. I called Diane the next morning and told her I wanted to move forward. She was honest about what it would mean. A contentious legal challenge against my own mother and brother, private family details exposed in court, almost certainly an irreparable rupture in whatever relationship I still had with both of them. I told her I understood. I told her I wanted to do it anyway. My mother called 3 days after I filed, at 9 p.m., no greeting. What in God's name do you think you're doing, Rachel? I told her I'd discovered Dad had made an earlier will, and I had every legal right to contest the one that replaced it. Your father's will is settled. This is exactly the kind of vindictive, jealous thing I would expect from you. Vindictive, jealous. Not I understand why you're upset. Just an immediate accusation designed to make me the villain for daring to question a decision that had erased me entirely. He left me a coffee mug, I said. And you've never needed more than that from us. You've always made that very clear. I almost laughed, except it wasn't funny. It was just devastatingly familiar. Even now, faced with a separate legal document proving her version of our family wasn't the only one, she was doing the exact same thing she'd always done, turning my pain into evidence of my own self-sufficiency. I asked her directly if she'd known about the earlier will. A real pause this time. Your father and I made decisions together, as a married couple. I don't owe you an explanation of every conversation we ever had. That wasn't a no. I noticed that immediately. I told her I'd see her in court and hung up. The first time in my life I'd hung up on my mother first. Tyler called the next day, and it was different. He opened by saying, Rachel, I genuinely didn't know about any of this. None of it. I want you to believe that. I believed him. I didn't think he had the patience to orchestrate something like this. This was always our mother's doing. He got quiet, then said, I've always kind of known things weren't fair growing up. I just never said anything because it benefited me. That's an ugly thing to admit. I told him honestly that knowing something is unfair and benefiting from it without ever speaking up isn't the same as being innocent. We didn't end the call on bad terms, but we didn't end it close either. Just this exhausted, complicated distance. Diane explained the legal mechanics to me over the following weeks. Contesting a later will requires proving specific grounds. usually undue influence, meaning the person who made the later will wasn't acting on their genuine wishes, but was pressured or controlled into decisions that didn't reflect what they actually wanted. My father's letter became the foundation of the case. His own handwriting, confessing the second will, didn't reflect what he believed was fair, that he'd been talked into it to keep peace. Diane also wanted to subpoena financial records on Tyler's business failures and the repeated bailouts to show a long-standing pattern of financial favoritism, supporting the broader picture. This took 7 months. Depositions, document requests, long stretches of waiting that felt heavier than the actual hard moments, because waiting gives your brain too much room to imagine every possible way things could go wrong. I barely spoke to my mother. Tyler and I had a few strained, logistical conversations, mostly about whose lawyer needed which document by when. The family group chat, which had always been mostly her and Tyler discussing nothing in particular, went silent on my end completely, and nobody seemed to notice for almost 3 weeks. The deposition was one of the hardest days of the whole process, harder than I expected it to be going in. It happened in a conference room at Diane's office, my mother across the table with a litigation attorney beside her, not Gregory, since apparently estate planning and trial law are different specialties, something I hadn't known until all of this started. There was a court reporter typing every word, which made the whole room feel more serious than I think any of us were prepared for. Diane asked whether she'd been aware of the earlier will. I don't recall the specifics, my mother said, her hands folded on the table, exactly the way they'd been folded in Gregory's office the day the first will was read. Diane asked whether she remembered conversations with my father about changing his estate plans in the 2 years before the second will was created. We discussed our finances regularly, as married couples do. I don't remember specific dates. I watched her choose every word with the precision of someone protecting herself, not the relaxed way she usually spoke. This wasn't the woman who casually told a 14-year-old she was never planned. This was a woman who understood she was now in actual legal jeopardy. Diane's last question mattered most. Mrs. Bennett, do you believe you treated your 2 children equally throughout their lives? A hesitation. Then, I believe I gave each of my children what they needed. Diane told me later that answer was, functionally, an admission. She'd reframed unequal treatment as giving each child what they needed, which, next to 30 years of documented favoritism, doesn't help her case at all. Have you ever heard a parent use almost that exact phrase to justify obvious favoritism? I think it's one of the most common deflections in families like mine. The trial happened on a Tuesday in October, 7 months after I first walked into Diane's office. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. No towering ceilings, just fluorescent lighting and uncomfortable benches, the kind of room you'd expect for a parking dispute, not for the dismantling of an entire family's mythology. My mother sat with her attorney, in a navy blazer I recognized from church. Tyler sat beside her, even though he wasn't technically a required party. He came anyway. I still don't fully know what to make of that. Diane built her case methodically. The earlier will, properly notarized. My father's letter, eventually admitted after some back and forth about authenticity, resolved through handwriting verification, and Diane's own testimony about receiving it directly from him months before his death, in that same small office. Then she called me to testify. Sitting in that chair, looking at my mother's face, was one of the hardest things I've ever done, not because I doubted what I was about to say, but because some exhausted part of me still wanted her to look proud of me instead of furious. I noticed my hands were shaking against the wood of the witness box, the same way they'd shaken in Diane's office the day I read my father's will for the first time. I told the court about the report card, the car, the loan I repaid versus the $15,000 that never was, about the funeral, about being left out of the eulogy entirely. About being told at 14 I was never planned. My voice cracked on that last one, and I didn't try to hide it. I watched several people react to that detail. Even the judge's expression shifted slightly. There's something about hearing a specific, ugly sentence spoken plainly, without exaggeration, that lands differently than a general description of favoritism ever could. My mother's attorney tried to frame my testimony as the exaggeration of a disgruntled sibling, asking if I had documentation beyond memory, his tone implying he already knew the answer was no. I told him about my journals, the ones I'd started at 16, written with no idea they'd ever matter, no possible motive to lie. The most devastating entry, read aloud in court by Diane in a slow, deliberate voice, was from when I was 17, my mother telling my aunt that Tyler was the heart of the family and I was the backbone. And 17-year-old me writing, almost matter-of-factly, that backbones were important, she supposed, but she just wished, for once, someone wanted to be the heart of something because of her. Someone in the gallery gasped softly. I didn't look to see who. I kept my eyes on the wood grain of the witness box until the room went quiet again. My mother testified after me, smoothing her skirt before she sat, her attorney framing her choices as a reasonable parent responding to her children's different needs. Almost word for word, the same justification she'd given me my entire life, just dressed in legal language. Like 30 years of favoritism could be repackaged as good parenting if you used the right vocabulary. Diane's cross-examination is the part I think about most. Mrs. Bennett, did you ever tell your daughter, at 14, that she was never planned? My mother went pale. I don't specifically recall saying that, but you don't deny it's something you could have said? A long pause. I was under a lot of stress during those years. I may have said things I shouldn't have. That vague admission landed heavily. I watched the judge writing notes during that exact exchange. Diane's closing argument was simple. A parent is allowed to make mistakes, even significant ones. This case was about whether a dying man's genuine final wishes, documented in a notarized will, explained in his own handwriting, should be honored, or permanently overridden by a second will created under what the evidence strongly suggested was years of accumulated pressure from his spouse. The judge took 11 days, the longest 11 days of my life. The ruling came down almost entirely in my favor. The court found the totality of evidence, the letter, the documented favoritism, my mother's inconsistent testimony, supported undue influence in the creation of the second will. My father's earlier will would be honored. I got the house. I got 60% of the savings. The clause requiring joint evaluation of Tyler's business funding was upheld. I want to be honest, when Diane called to tell me the ruling had come through, I didn't feel triumphant. I sat down on my kitchen floor again, the same spot where I'd cried after the will reading. And I just stayed there for a while, not really crying this time, just breathing, like something that had been clenched in my chest for 31 years had finally been allowed to let go. Tyler's landscaping business, funded by the $50,000 from the will that had originally given him everything, had already been struggling before the trial even ended. Most of the money sunk into equipment and a commercial lease he genuinely couldn't afford on his own income. He'd hired 2 employees he didn't have steady enough work to keep paying. Once the original will was overturned, that money was no longer his to draw from, and the joint evaluation clause meant he couldn't simplicity ask our mother to cover the gap the way he always had before. Within 4 months, the business closed permanently. He sold the equipment at a loss and moved into a 1-bedroom apartment across town. I didn't celebrate that. I want to be honest about that, because I think a satisfying ending isn't the same as a happy one. I felt something more complicated. A sad, quiet recognition that his entire foundation had been money that was never supposed to be his in the first place. And once it disappeared, there was nothing real underneath to hold the rest up. Tyler had never been taught to build anything that could stand on its own, and that wasn't really his fault. It was just the cost of being someone's whole world for 30 years. My mother reached out twice after the ruling. The first was a text, 3 weeks later. I hope you're happy with what you've done to this family. I didn't respond. I read it 4 or 5 times, though, looking for some version of softness underneath it, and not finding any. The second was almost a year later, at my cousin's baby shower, of all places. I almost didn't go, specifically because I knew she'd be there. She found me near the dessert table, away from everyone else, and said, "I've had a long time to think about everything that happened. I'm not going to pretend I understand all of it, or that I agree with the court's decision. but I know I made your childhood harder than it needed to be. I'm sorry for that, Rachel. I genuinely am. I stood there holding a small plastic plate of cake I hadn't taken a single bite of, trying to figure out if I believed her. I think I did, actually. Not completely. But enough to know it wasn't nothing. It didn't fix anything. It didn't undo 31 years, and it didn't undo the funeral, or the deposition, or the way she had called me vindictive for asking to be seen. But it was the first time in my life my mother said sorry, without immediately following it with a justification, and that mattered more than I expected it to. I told her I appreciated it, and that I needed time before I knew what kind of relationship we could rebuild, if any. She nodded, and I watched something in her face that looked almost like relief, like she'd been carrying that sentence around for months, waiting for somewhere to put it down. We didn't hug. We haven't talked much since. Beyond polite exchanges at events neither of us can fully avoid, a wedding here, a holiday there, careful and brief. I moved into my father's house about 5 months after the ruling. Walking through that front door as the legal owner was one of the strangest feelings of my life. I stood in the entryway for a long time before I even brought in a single box. This was the house where I'd been told I was never planned. This was the porch where my mother found my father, where I'd sat on that swing exactly twice in my whole childhood, because she never wanted it to wear out. This was the house my father built with his own hands, board by board, before I existed at all. And finally, after everything, it was mine. I found his coffee mug in a box of things Tyler had left behind when he moved out, packed carelessly, almost as an afterthought, wedged between a stack of old work boots and a tangle of phone chargers. I sat on the kitchen floor of my new house and held it for a long time. I'd spent months thinking of that mug as a symbol of everything wrong with how my family saw me. Holding it again in a house that was finally legally mine, it became something else entirely. Proof that even in the version of events where he felt he couldn't fight my mother openly, my father had still kept something of mine every single day on his actual desk for over 20 years. I keep that mug on my desk now. I use it every single morning, coffee first before I do anything else. I want to leave you with something my father wrote, something I saved for the end. I hope that by the time you read this, you've already built a life that doesn't need my approval to feel complete. But if any part of you is still waiting for someone to say you were enough all along, I'm saying it now. You were always enough, Rachel. I just ran out of time to prove it while it could have mattered most. I think about that sentence almost every day. I don't know if my relationship with my mother will ever be what I once wanted. I don't know if Tyler and I will rebuild something real, now that the safety net that defined so much of our relationship is gone. I don't have a perfectly tied bow to put on this. What I have is a house my father built, a coffee mug he kept for 24 years, and a letter that finally told me the truth I'd spent my entire life waiting to hear. If you've made it this far, I think you probably have your own version of this story. Your own version of being the backbone instead of the heart. Your own version of a parent who saw you more clearly than they ever managed to say out loud. I'd really love to hear it if you're willing to share it, because I think stories like this only become bearable when we realize how many of us are quietly carrying the exact same weight. Thank you for listening to mine.